Thanks, everyone, for being here. In a second, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to tell us about the last thing they consumed, watched, and also cared about. Important distinction. So this is me giving everyone a heads up, but first I'm going to introduce them to you. So to my left is Jared Richards, a culture critic and author. He's the entertainment reporter at the ABC and also runs Queries, a queer reading night in Sydney. Next to Jared is Alison Willmore, a film critic at Vulture and New York magazine. She was formerly a culture writer at BuzzFeed News, the TV editor at IndieWire, and a co-host of the podcast Film Spotting SVU. And finally, we've got Hannah Diviney, who's a writer, disability advocate, actress, screenwriter, and author. She wrote the book I'll Let Myself In and is an actor who you might have seen in the SBS original series Latecomers. And she's also making her feature film debut in the MIFF premiere fund-supported Audrey, which had its premiere at the festival last night. Please welcome everyone. So these past few weeks, it feels like in culture has been all about the Olympics, some big Australian names making waves everywhere, a big conference where entertainment conglomerates announce their slate of upcoming films that to me sound like jokes from 30 Rock, and conversations about whether or not tornado movies need kissing. And I'm curious to know what each of you have been consuming and interested in. Jared, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so none of that. So there was a Faye Dunaway doco on HBO that was not great, but it pointed me towards something that's amazing that's on YouTube. In 2005, she was a judge on a short-lived reality show called The Starlet. Have you heard of this?
No, but it
feels like really your area.
Sounds up my alley, knowing nothing about it so far.
So clearly made off the back of America's Next Top Model. It was a WB reality show where 6-ish starlets, they're all like 18 to 22-year-olds, compete in acting challenges, which are less drag race and kind of more, here's a guy from One Tree Hill and you have to act against him, and here's also a Garnier Fructis commercial, which is the sponsor of the Starlet as well.
Oh my God.
Faye is ruthless. Like, she is so harsh in all of her critiques of these terrible actors as well. They just make them cry endlessly. It's like absolute torture. I'm loving it so much. And it's all on YouTube. Oh, and Vivica A. Fox is the other judge, and then there's some random gay guy who's also so mean.
Always.
Yeah.
Is the goal to be the starlet by the end? Are they knocking them off each week?
Yes.
Okay.
And they're living in Marilyn Monroe's house as well. Oh, there's so much in this show. It's really wild.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
All right, so this is now the starlet panel. Welcome.
I will say the winner, I won't spoil who it is, but did not go on to have much of a career.
It feels if you're going to be the starlet, you're competing to be the starlet, that already feels like can't you be the star?
Yeah.
You're setting people up for difficult things. You know?
Wow, tragic. I mean, she's learning a lesson early on in her career. Alison, what about you?
Well, I saw a film here that has been on my mind a lot. I saw The Substance. Was anyone else there at that screening? Yeah, it was a packed house, which is the ideal way to see that film. It's Demi Moore as an actor, celebrity, really, it's unclear. In the world of the film, you can become enormously famous by hosting an aerobics class, a morning aerobics class. This is like the height of kind of celebrity. But
that genuinely feels like something that could happen in real life, though.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, the way the internet is going right now, you're like,
it's possible.
Yoga with Adrian's next move, maybe.
But it's this body horror film in which her character gets kind of ousted from her position and then is offered, this Faustian bargain of partaking in the substance, which offers a chance for her to kind of become younger again, but in a really grotesque way that immediately starts to offer complications. This film just goes so hard in terms of the body horror and the gore. Apparently, someone was telling me that someone behind him fainted 3 times. the same person, which I admire, because I'm
Yeah.
like, if you faint the first time, you think some people would go home, but this person was just
Perseverance,
like,
I know.
it was like, I am going to stay.
It's more the second faint that has me curious, because it's
Right.
like, now this is just my thing, but
Yes.
I'm here for the rest of the
But I'm
movie.
stuck.
Hannah, what about you? What's something you've been into lately?
Well, I just recently did a rewatch of The Princess Diaries 2 to celebrate the 20th anniversary. Because I just wanted to check, like, does the film still hold up? And I'm pleased to say it does.
Yeah.
And then something that I haven't read or seen yet, but I've been consuming a lot of content around, is the whole It Ends With Us, Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni situation. Just trying to work out what the heck is going on and how the internet seems to have so viciously turned against Blake Lively. Whether rightly or wrongly, I haven't quite figured that out yet. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to market a movie that mentions and has references to domestic violence, but I also struggle with people not knowing that that's what the movie was about, because if you watch the trailer for like more than a minute, it becomes pretty obvious. So I'm not sure where they're consuming their idea that it's like a summer rom-com, because it was pretty clear straight away from the trailer that it's not.
Yeah, yeah. That takes me to one of the questions I had for later on that I'm just going to bump up to now, because there are these movies that it feels like every few months we get a big blockbuster movie, and the conversation, like, I don't know what It Ends With Us is like as a film, but I feel like I know so much about the kind of like machinations behind the scenes and the media tour and all of this. And we have these every now and then. The last one I could think of is like Madam Web, where it was the conversation
and then before
was,
that, Don't Worry Darling, because everybody saw that press tour, right?
yeah, and Anyone But You, even, where there's a lot to say about that film, but also not very much to say. But like is there an on-set kind of like affair going on was kind of dominating the headlines. And so I'm curious. All of you write about film and pop culture. Is when the discourse is this loud and when there's so much going on off screen, is it possible to shut out that noise and just take the film on its merits when you're writing about it, or how do you approach this when, say, like a Don't Worry Darling, to take like a kind of less recent example?
I don't think you can, nor at least I wouldn't want to, just because
shut out the noise.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to shut out the noise, because to me that's probably the more interesting conversation, is how people are engaging with this art, which is like a loose term. I don't know. Things exist in the context, so you have to take them on the
These
context.
films did not fall out of a coconut tree.
No.
Yeah.
They were funded by the New South Wales government for a long time. And for me, like as a critic or whatever word, I find that those conversations are more fun as well, and I feel like criticism needs more fun generally.
Alison, what about you?
I try to do both. I think sometimes the discourse, especially when it builds up in advance, can be really unfair to what a film actually is. So I do want to be fair if to engage what is actually on screen in terms of a review. But I also feel like there is plenty of opportunity in writing about film to also talk about that fact that it does live in the world. And also, these days it feels like films need that discourse. If you don't have that, you're kind of slipping by uncommented on, just like another piece of content potentially that like comes and goes. So to ignore that feels like you are ignoring the fact that, for better or worse, this is something that has gotten traction. There's so much noise now. So if something does get traction, that feels worth commenting on in itself.
Is there an opportunity working somewhere like New York Mag where you can go, I don't want to write the review for Vulture, I want to go over to the cut and write the kind of what everyone, I can't stop thinking about this thing.
I feel like Vulture would be like, no, you got to do that for us. But absolutely, yes. I think and I'm a big fan of being like, if you're not going to do, it doesn't have to be a traditional review. You can engage with some aspect of a work, whether it's in the film itself or how it's living in the world, and that can be as fun and sometimes more interesting than the film itself.
Yeah.
Kate mentioned in her intro that this is the 4th year of this consuming culture event, and this is now the 3rd time I've hosted it. And so it was, in preparation, I was kind of going back and reading my notes and questions from last year, and I was like, wow, we really were all about like Barbie and Oppenheimer and like the new dawn for cinema, and everyone's, to quote Blake Lively, dressing up and going to the cinema. And, you know, there was this discourse 12 months ago that cinema was back and it had gone somewhere, and now all of a sudden it was back. And I guess being at a film festival, hearing that, it's like, okay, what are we all doing all this time if it was gone? Anyway, I'm curious to know how you all feel kind of at this point, like trends in movie going and in criticism and in audience behavior. Like, have you seen a market shift in the last 12 months, either in your experience or anecdotally, in the way people are kind of like responding to movies and cinema? Hannah, have you?
Look, I haven't had the opportunity to really step into film criticism as much as I would like to eventually explore doing that. I think getting paid to watch movies and talk about them sounds like the greatest job ever. But for me, something I've noticed is that it's like what you were saying before, you really need to be able to cut through. And I think what was so interesting and expansive about Barbie and Oppenheimer was the fact that they were obviously polar opposites, huge casts, huge directors, big budgets kind of stuff. But then, like, I think if you have a movie that doesn't do that, or that doesn't have the big budget or the big names, how do you balance it? And something else I've noticed, like you mentioned before about all the upfronts that the streaming companies have had, and not that I want to call them out or anything, but like when I was looking at Disney's list of potential films, I was seeing a lot of remakes, a lot of live action versions, a lot of sequels that I'm not sure yet if they're going to further the plot of the world they exist in, or whether they exist just to be gratuitous sequels. That remains to be seen. I hope not, for the sake of Toy Story and The Incredibles legacy in particular. I'm like, please don't ruin my childhood movies. But I think it's really interesting that people are finding it harder to make films when there seems to be less of a reliance or less of a leaning towards original ideas. Like, I have obviously been campaigning for a disabled Disney princess for a number of years now. And I've gotten to the point with the idea and kind of the story that I'm like, well, if Disney's not going to come to the party, I'll figure out how to make it independently, because the power of the story and the power of the representation or the messaging is more important than waiting for a big corporation like that to get on board. But I look around and I think about all the screenwriters and the actors that I know, and I go, there are original ideas out there. So what's the disconnect between these legacy employees and original ideas? Like, is it just that people have run out of ideas and there needs to be fresh perspectives or fresh diversity in the room, or what's the deal? But yeah, it just seems really disconnected from me. And seeing people's reactions to all of those remakes and live action films, it's just exhaustion. It's like, can you just come up with something new? Like, we're hungry for new stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, the guarantee of kind of IP work isn't there anymore, right? Like, we're hearing every day about like a Coyote versus Acme movie being shelved, or like Batgirl was another big one this past year. Like, do these, Alison, do you find in like thinking or reading about these that there was kind of a safe bet in like IP work that just isn't there anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's unfortunate sometimes that like so much of writing about pop culture becomes like, it revolves around Marvel, like as this kind of like, gravitational force, whether you're deeply invested in those films or don't care about them. But I found, I was like, I missed my connecting flight here from New York. And so I spent the day in Arlington, Texas. So it was 103 degrees. And I went to see Deadpool and Wolverine, which I had not seen before. And I was watching this film, which was a huge hit, but like didn't feel like a sign of life in that world so much as like this like far end point, you know, like it is filled with jokes that assume that you have been keeping up with like the trade notices enough to know that Channing Tatum was once attached to a Gambit movie, you know, like that is an extended joke, and to kind of like to expect that from an audience and maybe get that response, it feels to me like something that's really kind of like run out of energy. And it feels like we're on the cusp of seeing what's next, and I do feel hopeful. You know, in terms of like even big entertainment, you know, much less like the kind of thriving independent scene. But I also, it's hard to put much trust in the big studios, which are clearly, I think, at the moment still really operating out of a place of fear.
Yeah, that idea that, I mean, it sounds like hell to me, like watching a big superhero fun blockbuster and thinking that there are jokes that were clearly written for like the exexecutives signing off on the project.
There are jokes about like corporate acquisition.
Yeah, wow. Grim. But there's, well, I had something that I wanted to say after this and now I've just lost it. Okay. When you think about like the audience that you're writing for, when you're writing a piece of criticism, I'm curious to know who you imagine them as, because sometimes I read like a really eviscerating or really on point piece of criticism and I'm like, I'm so grateful that I got to read this and like be on the same level as the person writing it. And other times I sometimes go on TikTok and I feel like my brain is melting out of my ears. There are lots of very clever minds on there and like really interesting conversations, but sometimes it feels like to get big numbers or get big engagement or get your take kind of heard, it needs to be cut down to the most simplistic kind of point of view. Jared, when you're writing a review or a piece of criticism, who do you imagine to be your kind of ideal reader in your head?
Ooh, I don't have one, which maybe I should. I think what you're talking about though is kind of that need to be like, I hated it or I loved it, and people who review kind of on a base of like, I gave the cinematography 2 stars, but the script was 4 stars, and then the cute factor was 2 stars, and it's like it's not a mathematical equation, but I think there's this need for like criticism or content around film to be very easily digestible. So I suppose I want to avoid that as much as possible, but I'm also not on TikTok, so I think that makes it a bit easier.
I'm so jealous.
I'm on Instagram Reels though, so I get it like 3 days later.
I famously quit TikTok for 6 months, but I'm back now and it's bad for me. Alison, what about you? For the I mean, you've worked for different outlets too, so has that audience in your mind kind of changed, or do you have to adapt to the publication's kind of remit?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Vulture and New York Magazine have an established voice, more this kind of magazine-y voice that I'd been reading a lot before I started working there. So, but I think, yeah, I also don't feel like I have a particular reader in mind. What I always think about is just that a review in itself has a kind of obligation to be an entertaining piece of writing, you know, like something that can't just exist only in the context of the film that it's about. Like if someone's coming to it on its own, I think it has obligations, you know, to fulfill as a piece of writing. But I also feel like I want to always make sure that what I'm writing about lets the reader in some way, whether I'm like writing a negative review, positive review, you know, analysis. I think that there is no film that is inaccessible to someone unless you make it sound inaccessible. And I think that has always been important to me everywhere I've written, is to, I don't think you need to talk down to anyone, but I think like always to kind of like start from a place of, do we have a shared context?
Hannah, what about you? When you were, say, writing for Missing Perspectives, did you have a kind of ideal audience member in mind?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a slightly softer approach potentially, depending on how you handle it, but I would always imagine the person who made the thing reading what I wrote. And I don't mean that in the sense that like I would soften my thoughts about it to make them feel good. I just would make sure that if I had a criticism or something that I didn't like or something that I thought could be improved on, it was delivered in a way that didn't feel like it was punching down unnecessarily. And I think maybe that's a byproduct of having been at the center of a huge moment in pop culture when I managed to convince Lizzo and Beyonce to change ableist lyrics in their songs, and seeing some of the pieces that were spurned by the fact that I did that, and that would often make mention of me or make mention of the kind of dumpster fire that was my Twitter at that time. And I'm always thinking, like, what's helpful for the person to read? What's the thing that they're not going to feel like they've been, pierced in the heart, but what's the kind of criticism that they're going to go, actually, I hadn't thought of that. That's a good point. Let me take that on. Let me see what I can do better with the next thing. Yeah.
I'm really curious to know, like, you having been working in that capacity, writing about films, writing about filmmakers and actors and performers, and now being on the other side of the camera, has your experience working on Latecomers and Audrey, and you were just telling me about your next on-screen project backstage, has that kind of shifted anything in your writing, like what you look for, what you care about, now you've kind of seen how the sausage is made?
Yeah, well, I guess I always try to come at it from a point of view of what was this actor trying to do, and if I was playing this role, or if someone had given me this script, how would I have approached it? Where would we have been different? Where would we have been similar? And even if it doesn't quite hit, I'm like, I can sort of see the levels where it might have broken down, and because I also have now an innate understanding of all of the people who never get the glory when it comes to films, and how much a whole production kind of comes together to make the 120 minutes that you see. I think I'm always very curious about, like, well, what were the circumstances that they made this film, and how would that have felt? I wonder, like, how much creative freedom they had. Was the director good at giving notes? Like, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of get into the nitty-gritty of it a lot more now. And I always think about if someone wrote a bad review of my performance in something, which no doubt that they will do if they haven't already, and they will probably do multiple times, like, what's the thing when I'm reading that's going to mean that I can grow as an actor? What feels personal and maybe an attack, or what feels constructive and helpful?
Yeah. I'm curious to know, when I was thinking about what I wanted to kind of pick all three of your brains about, I kept coming back to the idea of, like, when you watch a film or a TV show, and you have, whether you like it or hate it, you have so much to say about it that the 700 words or the podcast 10-minute conversation just doesn't feel like enough. Has there been something like that for any of you recently, where you just want to come at something from, like, as many different ways as you can? Like, for me, that film was The Whale. When I saw it last year, I had so much to say about it. I wrote a review, and then I was like, nah, I still got more. I didn't get it all out. And I wanted to have conversations with people about it. I hated it, but and then the Oscars happened, and Brendan Fraser won, and so I was like, okay, I can keep talking about it. Have you guys had an experience like that with anything recently, or kind of maybe something that was, like, quite formative for you that you just couldn't get out of your head?
I don't know if this is quite what you're talking about, but when Top Gun Maverick came out, my colleague wrote the main review and wrote this really sprawling, great review. But I was like, I also need to weigh in on this movie, and I wrote a piece that was about my personal reaction to the way a particular scene was shot in that movie, where I remember early in the film when he's a test pilot, his, like, plane explodes, and I wrote a piece that was, like, goofy, but also I think became a kind of serious examination of the kind of dreamlike quality of, I would say, the latter half of that film, being like, he died. Tom Cruise's character died. Maverick died in that moment. The rest of the scene is like this death dream while he's burning up in the sky. That was, like, a goofy like blog post essentially that just became a whole essay that then went on to have a life to the point where I think someone even asked the filmmaker about it. But I think like sometimes it can be really fun to pursue that where you're like, it's not necessarily something that fits within the structure of a traditional review, but you have to get it out anyway.
Yeah.
I think a film I keep coming back to and have written about multiple times is Vox Lux, which I was just ranting about backstage as well, which, if you're not familiar, is from 2019. Brady Corbett directed it. Natalie Portman plays a pop star. The music is by Sia. She went through like bottom of the drawer stuff that she would not even give like Camila Cabello. And
Not even
Camila, no. Gave them to Natalie and was like, here you go, make this movie about your pop star who's also the survivor of a school shooting, who's also made a Faustian bargain with the devil to become a pop star, who also has...
Sia was like, I got it.
Yeah, she was like, I have the perfect song. I mean, that film for me... sometimes I think it's a terrible movie, sometimes I think it's magnificent, and I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, as most things are. But the ambition of that particular film, I think of like Megalopolis as well as a film that I would love to write about, but probably not review, because I don't think there's a definitive take on that, at least not for me. But there are so many different weird little angles that I think are worth really unpacking, and Vox Lux for that is up for me.
What about you, Hannah? Is there something you haven't, one piece alone couldn't capture?
I can't think of like a specific piece of pop culture because this happens to me a lot. My mum is sitting in the front row and she will attest to the fact that when I have thoughts about pop culture, they kind of just keep coming and coming and coming. And unfortunately, my family is not the right audience for these thoughts. And I find that sometimes the limitations of like a word count can be really, really affecting, because I'm like, but I didn't get to this bit. Yeah. And now it's not like a full piece. And someone's going to read it and go, but you didn't get to this bit.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I've started a Substack, because I'm like, word count be damned. It's just, if people want to read it, it's going to be like the 3,000 word full thoughts.
Yes.
Full download. Just everything in the kitchen sink thrown in.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Vox Lux brings up what we were talking about before we came out on stage, is like the pop star movie. Alison wrote a great review of Trap, the new M. Night Shyamalan film, which if you haven't seen it, and you really gotta, Josh Hartnett is in it and he takes his daughter to a concert, and the performer is a character, not real performer, called Lady Raven, played by M. Night Shyamalan's daughter Salika, who wrote all the songs herself. Not a single hook to be found. It's the same thing over and over for like, the concert goes for like 6 hours. It's incredible. And these like big concert in the era of like, the Eras tour, like we've never been more inundated with like pop star content. How are films dealing with like the pop star? Like how does Vox Lux stack up to like reality? I've never seen it, but like I've now seen Trap and I can see the ways that like it's taking some liberties. It's not, it can't quite be real because Josh Hartnett needs to get backstage at some point. How do you feel about this crossover of worlds?
Yeah, I think the probably like the pinnacle example of the fundamental problem of like the pop star film, I think, is that the actor can never be a pop star unless it's Lady Gaga in A Star Is Born. But Ali's music is terrible, like really, really bad, and she kind of is devoid of charisma except for Shallow. I always find that dynamic really fascinating. Vox Lux is incredibly dark. It kind of just spits up and chews out this 13-year-old girl, and we see her down the line, very washed up and very addled, and has many, many problems. And I think I like that because it's not really trying for realism. Like you could probably link that, but it's not doing it in like a, lack of a better word, like a Marvel or Taylor Swiftian kind of like Easter egg culture way. There's no one-to-one. And I think that's
culture. Real.
I think that's the best way to maybe handle it. I'm trying to think of some others recently. I mean, I loved The Idol. Jocelyn
felt very like real. Those first 2 episodes of The Idol I thought were incredible.
Yeah.
Then it kept happening. Then it just kept going.
But again, I liked that it was kind of gross because I imagine, and again, I'm imagining this because I'm not a pop star, not yet, but I also can't sing. But
it doesn't matter.
Actually, Camila Cabello. Sorry, so many strays. That's actually my #1 song of the year. I love it. Anyway, what I like about it is that it's so gross and it's so dark, and I think that's the element of pop that I'm fascinated with, like the cog in the machine. Mm-hmm. So that's what I want from a pop star film.
Yeah. I feel like there's also this element where most fiction about pop stars is essentially a kind of act of fan fiction, right? Like you have to project like your personal feelings about this figure or this fictionalized version of a real figure. Like we don't have access to, it is actually like unimaginable to me what the life of an actual like very famous pop star is like. It's probably so alien, right? And I think, what was the Anne Hathaway movie? We were just talking about it.
The idea
of you, which is called The Idea of You, even. Like, you know, and which allegedly the novel it's based on began as a work of kind of Harry Styles fan fiction. I mean, I feel like so much of it is about that idea, like this kind of particularly romantic idea of like, he's trapped, you know, this guy who's in a boy band is like this real sensitive, you know, musician, but is like trapped in this machine.
It's like a bird in a cage.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's a kind of romance in the movie itself to like that idea is really, if he could just, which I think is like a point of view of a certain type of fandom, right? Is that, especially with One Direction at that time, there were a lot of people being like, their real selves are like behind there.
Yeah, like Free Britney.
Exactly.
Simon Cowell is keeping them all in a dungeon.
Exactly.
Keeping them in the closet, in a dungeon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, that is interesting in itself, but also clearly like a very particular window. And then I also, you know, there are all of those, I find them usually quite boring, but like the documentaries that the pop star produces themselves, right? Like the kind of documentary self-portrait, which there's so many of them now. And they're kind of, I guess, interesting as like how someone chooses to portray themselves, but it's hard for me to look at them as films because they feel like they're a branding exercise. Yeah.
Did any of you watch the Selena Gomez one?
Yes, I have seen the Selena Gomez one.
Well, how did you feel? I have many thoughts, but how did you...
I have many thoughts, and we can unpack more of them off stage because I think if I started talking about this, it would explode. But I think, in some senses, I thought some of the stuff she chose to put in the final product that you saw was pretty brave. Mm-hmm. Like in terms of discussing her lupus or like all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And some of the other stuff I felt like I wanted to slap whoever had decided that this was the way that Selena Gomez was going to be portrayed, because I was like, you really don't have her best interests at heart, and that's very clear.
Interesting. I think the director was like the brother of her management team or something. It was like very inside, calls coming from inside the documentary kind of thing.
It was just too much, and there was a lot of like assumed, not just assumed knowledge, but like a lot of assumed reference, I guess, into understanding where Selena would be. And I was kind of like, I know this because I grew up with Wizards of Waverly Place. So like this makes sense to me because this was the pop culture happening as I was learning to consume pop culture.
Yeah.
But I think, it was a little bit inaccessible in that way too. And there were a few narrative arcs that I found to be a little bit strange. But back on the idea of pop star, like fiction, and this is obviously my personal view, the rest of the panel might disagree, but I think one that did it really well was Daisy Jones and the Six, because I think the music that they had for that show is music I listen to entirely separate from the show, just because it's kind of the Fleetwood Mac-esque
good fake music
vibes that I'm like, I can see why this works. But I think what's interesting is perhaps the way that the story was positioned, in that the way the book's written, the musicians are telling you it themselves, and then it's like all framed through their perspectives, even in the adaptation. So you already know that, like, their version of events is coloured by their own perception or their own biases or their own relationships with each other. There's going to be things that they didn't see. There's going to be things that they misinterpreted. Like, it's not trying to be some bird's eye view of what it was like. It's just in it, and I think that makes it more human and more messy and relatable and realistic in that sense.
Yeah. I think I feel like we could do a whole panel on pop star movies now, but the last two things I want to say is there's a Britney biopic allegedly coming out, and there's discourse about,
I don't know
like,
how I feel about that.
should it be Sydney Sweeney? I'm like, get an unknown. We need like an unknown, untouched.
But I'm also like, maybe just leave it be.
Yeah.
Maybe just leave Britney alone.
How many more times
let
can
the
this
woman
tragic
breathe.
tale be told?
Yeah.
But also, this new Anne Hathaway A24 film that Charlie XCX is writing the music for with Jack Antonoff, and Anne Hathaway's going to be like performing the songs. Very excited.
I can't wait for that.
Can't wait. Mother Mary, is that what it's called?
And
Yeah.
David Lowery's going to be here and hopefully talk about it.
Is he directing it?
Yeah, isn't he? Did I just make that up?
I don't know.
I think he did.
I was just
think he
honing in
is.
on the Antonoff and Charlie of it all.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry to not get to any of your questions until now. I'm going to read the first one. This is about kind of the information you need as a critic. Someone's asked, how much archival film knowledge do you think is required to be a good critic? Does knowing insert old white director's name here's whole filmography make a difference? And what makes a great critic or writer to you? Do you think you need to have kind of an encyclopedic knowledge?
I hope not.
Yeah, same.
Because I definitely don't.
Yeah.
I think you have to do research, obviously, to be informed, because if you go in and just view a film in a vacuum, you probably will make errors, or you will claim that a film's the first time to, I don't know, do something where it's just clearly not, or it's evoking something and you'll just miss a trend. So I think the best way to do that is by reading other criticism as well around a film, particularly when you're an Australian critic, because it's coming so late to you. So there's already a lot of discourse that you can build off and kind of integrate. But I don't know, I think like you need an enthusiasm. It depends what... We've been talking about contemporary stuff, so I think we exist in this context again to use that. So we have a lot of experience, but you still need to do your research. But I'm also not going to probably watch like, I don't know, all of insert old white filmmakers' movies to do an interview where that gets mentioned once.
Yeah.
But maybe I should.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to find a critic, I mean, if you do find one, I feel like it's always worrying, who doesn't feel hyper-conscious of their blind spots and their various areas where they don't have a feeling of expertise. But I do feel like, I mean, what is most important, in addition to that, like, research and, like, knowing what you don't know, is also to just always have a hunger to always be wanting to watch more and to be wanting to watch older things and to be filling in that kind of like the kind of back catalog. I think once you kind of lose that, that's when something kind of starts being missing.
I just had this really, not to talk about myself, but just this very difficult experience of reviewing a film that's actually playing at MIFF Kneecap, which is about it's a real band playing versions of themselves. The character names are the same as their real names.
That's the one about Belfast.
Yeah, they're in Belfast. So and their music's very political, and it's very much about like growing up post the Good Friday Agreement. Their lyrics reference like, very geographically and historically specific stuff. And so this was an example of like, it's the director's first film, so it wasn't about being really well versed on the filmmaker. It was more about making sure I had my history right and making sure I was using the right language, calling it Irish, not Gaelic. Like, I did about a day of research just before I even started talking about the film itself. Okay, another question. I might just roll through a few of the audience questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. What are your views on Letterboxd as the latest film social media platform and review forum for the general public? What does it represent for film criticism and consumption? Do you all use Letterboxd? Hannah, do you?
I don't have a Letterboxd account yet, but I have been Audrey did get some Letterboxd reviews after its world premiere at South by Southwest earlier in the year, which I found very entertaining to read. And I think it's so interesting for me as a actor and as someone who wants to make content to be able to have that easy access to people's thoughts on the film. Probably because I'm always like, did they like it? Okay, if they didn't like it, is that something I'm going to listen to or something I'm going to ignore? And for me, I think social media means that you can have a connection with your audience as a creator that you couldn't have before, because obviously there's no way that a creative team could attend every screening. It's not like you're going to stand there and accost people as they walk outside the cinema and go, give me your, like...
Tell me what you really think.
2-minute review.
Yeah,
like,
it's kind of what Letterboxd does.
yeah, but obviously it does that from the, like, personal space and boundary of it's up to them. It's from the comfort of wherever they are, like, all that kind of stuff. And you can choose how much or how little you engage with that, and whether or not it influences, like, future creative decisions is up to you. But I think it's really interesting to be in constant dialogue with your audience.
Alison, do you use Letterboxd? Do you use any kind of social logging or reviewing?
I use it just to log, but that's mostly for my own, because my brain is Swiss cheese and I immediately forget what I've seen otherwise. And so, I don't put reviews on there, and I not too deep in there, but I love that it exists. I think, I love that it's a mix of, like, people doing deep, sincere reviews and people competing to have the best quip. I think it is great to have a thriving online film culture, and I think, that should be encouraged.
When you're writing a more long-form review and you have to kind of take the temperature of, like, the audience consensus, is Letterboxd a place that you can do that, or is it more like Twitter, or where do you ever
I
do
usually
that?
don't do that. Okay. Like, if I'm writing something about maybe, like, a larger, like, pulling back a bit more about, like, how something's received, then I will. That, I don't know. Then I'll do a mix of, like, Letterboxd and IMDb and, like, all of the different places that all skew in particular directions. But I just enjoy kind of popping on there to see what people are saying. And like, that was something that Twitter used to be for me, and that now I feel...
Now you have to work really hard to find it. You just got to dig through all the layers of grime and muck and...
Or the algorithm of, like, moments when this film was meta thread. It's just, like, screenshots of...
Stop. Just tell me what you thought of it already.
Right, and then it's, like, my own personal feelings of being like, should I be on here at all anyway? Like, should I just let this go? So...
Okay.
Yeah.
Jared, what about you? Your feelings about Letterboxd?
I don't really review things on there. I just log them as well because my memory is terrible. I love seeing what my friends think about movies, and it generates really lovely conversations just on an interpersonal level. But it can also change my perspective. I remember The Substance when I saw it at Sydney Film Festival. I hadn't really, without spoiling the film, there's a fair bit about food in it and consumption and kind of like addiction, I suppose. And a person that I know is like a recovering alcoholic, and they wrote about their reaction to the film in that way, and it really opened up a lot that I didn't quite connect to in the film and made me like it a lot more. And I also like the little puns as well.
I love a little Letterboxd pun.
Yeah, I think it's a net good.
Yeah. Sometimes I find myself getting, and this probably says more about me than the platform, but I sometimes will, like, take the temperature of other people's reviews, and sometimes mine is like, everyone's getting this wrong because of these reasons. And that was the case for a film at MIFF last year called How to Have Sex, where I was reading reviews by, and I noticed mostly male critics basically being like, do we need this film in 2023? And I was like, yeah, we fucking do. And here are the reasons why. And so, like, I find myself getting, like, I've got to step away. This is just... Sorry, you don't need to go hear my machinations.
I think like what you were talking about earlier in terms of film culture post Barbie and Oppenheimer, it's very like June popcorn bucket. It's very like Ryan Reynolds marketing, megalith. And so it's quite nice that something feels relatively organic on the internet, which is kind of rare. Yeah.
And I remembered earlier I had that kind of like brain... I lost transmission. I was like, what was I about to talk about again? And it was the idea of like Alison, you had been talking about the marketing behind something like a Deadpool and the kind of like the feeling of like the studio-ness in it. And I was thinking about something like Neon, the studio, which is kind of, a few years ago we were up here talking about A24 and the marketing machine there, and it feels like Neon has kind of stepped in as this new version of that. A lot of the reviews of Longlegs recently were talking about like the marketing said X, but I feel Y, you know, like, and I feel like I'm tracking that on Letterboxd too, where people approach an A24 project differently. They're now approaching like a Neon project differently. Yeah. Sorry, no question, just me thinking out loud. Okay, this is an interesting question from the audience. Have you ever liked or hated a piece of media and then been surprised when your opinion doesn't align with the general consensus?
Yes.
Fox Lux.
well, yes. Yeah, no, I don't really want to talk about it.
Okay. Alison, what about you?
Yeah.
Wait, I want to know what that is later.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, wait, can we? I mean, maybe because we mentioned it, I mean, I didn't like Barbie. I did not have a sense of what the reaction was going to be, you know, which is one of the luxuries of seeing something at a press screening and then, you know, squirreling yourself home and being like, I'm just going to write about this from that experience. I don't know. Yeah, certainly. And like it's not always a really pleasant experience afterwards. You know, like I think one of the things that has been nice about like social media getting more splintered and like, you know, I've pulled back from it a lot is just not worrying as much about just how much rage gets directed at you for, you know, saying you didn't like something that people thought was good or the other way around sometimes. I gave like a kind of like lukewarm but like positive review to Tammy, the Melissa McCarthy comedy from like, I don't know, years ago. And someone got so angry at me and just said all of these like fatphobic things about her. And it was just, I don't know, you never know what's going on inside someone's head, but it's fascinating sometimes when you say like, it sparks something so personal and angry in someone for diverging from what they felt.
Yeah. Hannah, what about you? When do you feel like you haven't aligned with the popular consensus?
I mean, this has happened so many times, but I'm going to go back in time a little bit to when I was a teenager, and this is going to break Brodie's heart, I know, but most, if not 95% of the girls that I interacted with at school back in like 2012, etc., were obsessed with One Direction, to the point of like that was what they would construct entire school weeks worth of conversations about. And instead of doing the easy thing, which would have been to just like get on board the train and start to have an opinion or a feeling or a favourite or whatever it was, I went, nope, I'm not going to like that. Bye. Which was really a dumb move socially. If I could go back and tell my 12-year-old self, it would probably be like, just...
Those were the good years.
Just pretend. But also, I'm terrible at faking it. Like, I don't have a poker face. It's just if I don't like something or if I don't engage with something, you will know straight away. And I think while I admit that it probably would have been easier socially to just go with the grain, there is a part of me that's like, no, you knew what you liked and what you didn't, and it's perfectly okay to have your own taste and not be a sheep.
Yeah, stand in your taste. I personally loved Madam Web, and I feel like
Me too.
everyone's take was not giving that film the respect it deserved. It was a fun time at the movies.
I do have an actual answer.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Were you worried you were going to be like cancelled or doxxed?
No. I just didn't want to start that conversation about that film. But different film. I didn't like really connect to Past Lives, which is a film that a lot of people found super emotional. But I think as a critic or as a writer, I'm not the definitive opinion on anything, and I don't want to be. And I'm just like, okay, well, I'm either missing something or it meant something to a lot of other people. So what did they find interesting? And I'm more invested in reading about that or having those conversations and being like, probably not going to change my mind. I found everybody's acting really wooden, but that's just me. And maybe I didn't have a Pepsi in the cinema, you know? Like, film is so subjective. It can depend on your mood in the day. So, yeah.
I do really like reading, and this is mostly on Letterboxd and like short form takes when someone there's something that's kind of feels like it's universally beloved. And if you didn't like it, I really like seeing how people rationalize it, being like, maybe I just was in a bad mood. Maybe I wasn't in the right headspace because you guys are probably right. But, you know, there's no such thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got... Oh, great question. What are your thoughts on hate watching? Think Emily in Paris and other... Okay, I'm quoting this. This isn't me. And other terrible series like Selling Sunset, which... on its merits, it's kind of fun. But, okay, hate watching. Do you have a place...
Who has time for hate watch? Like, why?
You make the time.
No, but like, you only get so much time to consume content. Why would you bother wasting your energy and, like, let's be honest, attaching a nuclear missile to your mood, like torpedoing it? Why would you do that? Just, the world is hard enough. Like, let's just get our joy where we can and leave it at that, yeah?
Sometimes the dumb stuff's really fun, though. And
Yeah, no,
sometimes...
I know, but
Yeah.
if you know that it's going to annoy you, just don't engage.
Maybe hate watching's the wrong word, but something that you would never have to write about, you don't have to think critically about. Kate, who introduced the session, often refers to this kind of viewing as like brain in a hammock. Like you just let it go and you just let it wash over. You don't have to work on it. Alison, what's your vibe on this?
I'm not like a huge hate watcher in terms of like being at home and seeking stuff out, like just to kind of like press on the bruise a bit and, you know, kind of enjoy that. But I do sometimes like ask for to review a film that I feel like I'm probably not going to like. And I feel like, I mean, the trick with that is that you still have to go in with an open heart, right? You have to be prepared to be like, maybe I will love this. Maybe it'll sweep me off my feet. But I think sometimes there can be a kind of schadenfreude, you know, a kind of satisfaction that comes with watching something where you're like, yes, this is doing everything I thought it would in the worst way possible. Yeah, but I think I'm with you in terms of like kind of for personal viewing, I kind of feel like life is too short. Yeah.
Alison, you were talking recently about that streaming service, the cozy streaming service.
Oh, yeah.
That's not hate watching, but I feel like that's worth mentioning.
Yeah, that's my
as
brain
well.
in the hammock. I'm not a huge reality TV person, but I have recently gotten enough into watching like cozy murder mysteries as like my like background TV that they gave me a free subscription. It's called Acorn TV. So
Acorn TV?
Yes. How is that for a name of like just cozy?
Yeah.
You know, yeah. It's, you know, the kind of thing where you're like, she's a antiques dealer in the south of France who solves murders. Or, you know, Lucy Lawless bakes bread in Auckland and solves murders. Yeah.
It's always baking, always baking.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really hate watch anything. Like I will watch things that I think are bad, like Emily in Paris. And I think a few years ago, maybe I would feel the need to defend it and be like, oh, it's actually like a postmodern comment, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
I think I'm just sincerely being like, she's pretty.
Yeah. She takes selfies
Yeah.
in berets. Yeah, I feel a similar way about, say, like The Real Housewives, where
Yeah.
I get that people want to really argue it on an intellectual level, being like, this is a representation of women in a certain socioeconomic class and age group that's not normally on TV. But I'm like, I like when they fight. I like when they yell and fight and call each other names. I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to come back to a question that I came up with this morning because I actually read one of those threads on Twitter and I really loved it. And it was from someone who is in their 30s and is doing a rewatch of Sex and the City, and they're kind of talking about how, sorry, I wish I had this person's name, but in their teens and in their 20s, they viewed the Carrie Big relationship through a very different lens. And it made me think about that show in particular, my relationship to it as I've gotten older, when you realise that you're older than Carrie was in the first season, things change a little. Are there shows for you that as you've gotten older, shows or movies, that you revisit and you kind of have a very different approach or reception of?
My Gen Z boyfriend hadn't seen Girls, so that was such a joy to
It's
revisit.
having a real moment
It
with
really
the
is.
generation, isn't it?
And it's so fascinating to see how your opinions on Hannah change over time. I have a lot of empathy for her. I feel like Marnie's having a real culture moment at the moment. Shoshana is the only sane one.
Lena Dunham told Taylor Swift that she was a Marnie.
That's more biting
you
than
imagine?
anything I could
Can you
ever
imagine?
write about Taylor Swift.
True, yeah.
Yeah.
And her friend said it.
And I think there's one scene, it went around on like Instagram, on like TikTok Reels or something recently, but it is where Becky Ann Baker, Hannah's mum, is talking to her about Adam and just being like, he's broken, essentially, you can't fix him. And Hannah's really incredulous and annoyed and like, I can't believe you would say that. And I don't know, when I watched it when I was younger, I was like, yeah, the mum's being such an annoying person. Like, they're meant to be, but then you kind of go through a relationship like that or something. And the way that I now identify with the mum and the difficulty that she's having watching her daughter fuck up again and again and again. It's really beautiful. That show, how did she write that when she was so young?
I know.
Yeah.
And it didn't, the discourse around it at the time, it was truly such a terrible, you realise like how much
It was so basic.
I'd like to think that the critical discourse would be different now, but who knows?
Sometimes like you're just people are so deep in it, like it almost like, it becomes its own thing beyond the actual like show itself. And like almost like it gathers its own steam. I guess like in terms of a show, I've gone back to multiple times, Freaks and Geeks, I would say. I think it's so incredibly well written, I think, and very funny, but also, I mean, a funny thing about revisiting it is that the cast became so famous. You know, it has just like a slate of, and so like there is this other experience of rewatching it where, well, one, sometimes you just see someone in there that you didn't even remember, like Rashida Jones is like in a single episode as this like kind of like mean popular girl who fights with Busy Phillips, but like to watch it gives you like different feelings every time depending on like the level of where different cast members are, you know, like whatever your kind of like the arc of our relationship as a public with James Franco, you know, like who is like, but or Seth Rogen. But I also think, I think a lot about the state of comedy in particular. I mean, a lot of the people went on to make films and like everyone frets about whether like the kind of studio comedy is dead. But I think when you watch Freaks and Geeks, which is obviously a TV show made by people who would go on to make a lot of films, I think you kind of appreciate why TV has carried a lot of that burden in recent years, because you can spend enough time with these characters, as with Girls as well, where I think like there is a benefit to, as much as I miss seeing more studio comedies on the big screen, there's a benefit to being able to spend time with these characters and to allow them to kind of build up and then to have comedy come from that as well.
I mean, for me, my comfort kind of rewatch is always going to be Friends, just because I think so much of how I approach comedy and wit in particular and this has been something I've been thinking about a lot because Audrey as a dark comedy has been specifically shaped by the way that Matthew Perry would approach a certain scene, I think. But for me, what trips me out is like I started watching that show when I was like 14, 15, and now I'm the same age they were as they were making it, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. And I think there's also and if there's any other Friends fans out there, you can tell me if this is true or not, but I think in the beginning, you're very much like, Ross and Rachel, will they get together? Won't they get together? You're rooting for them. You're whatever. And now I'm like, that's not healthy. Stop that.
Yeah.
I'm like, no offense to Ross Geller, but you can do so much better, Rachel Green. Like, what are you doing? And like, the far more comfortable kind of relationship dynamic that I would strive for is like Monica and Chandler. I'm like, yeah, no, they're the much healthier couple on that show. So I think things will grow and change as I kind of get more experience as well as an actor or behind the scenes. But yeah, I do like going back and revisiting things and just feeling comfy.
We're out of time. That just flew by. Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our panel.